Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a seriously provocative, highly opinionated new proposal all about Australia's mining exports and climate policies. The source text we're looking at, called Power and Prosperity, the Sovereign Wealth of Coal, pitches a radically different vision for managing national resources. And let me tell you, it doesn't pull any punches. Whether you align with the politics of it or not, the underlying arguments are honestly absolutely fascinating. So our goal here is to just neutrally break down exactly what this author is proposing, why they're proposing it, and how they view the current economic and environmental landscape.
All right, let's dive right in. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this ambition, we've got to look at a very specific number first: $1.5 trillion. That is the size of Norway's massive sovereign wealth fund, a fund built entirely from their oil revenues. The author uses this 1.5 trillion figure as the ultimate benchmark for success. Basically, the text points out that Norway didn't just, blow their resource money on day-to-day spending. They actually had the discipline to save it, and in doing so, created the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund. The core premise we're looking at here is that Australia should be looking directly at this massive number and asking, wait, why aren't we doing exactly the same thing?
To carefully examine this mandate, we're going to structure today's explainer into 5 key sections, mapping out the author's perceived problems, their critiques, and their radical solutions. We'll hit the sovereign wealth vision, the proposed export tax, critiquing climate policy, the export hypocrisy argument, and finally, a coal-fired future.
Starting off with Section 1, the Sovereign Wealth Vision. Right off the bat, the author draws a really stark contrast between two totally different approaches to national wealth. On one side, you have Norway, which gets huge praise for its economic discipline. But on the flip side, you have Australia's current approach. The text argues that every single ton of iron ore, lithium, coal, and gas shipped out of Australia should be building a massive national nest egg. But instead, this incredible wealth supposedly just vanishes into everyday government spending and politicians' pet projects. The big contention here is that Australia clearly has the resources, we're literally digging it out of the ground, but sorely lacks the discipline to manage it for the long haul. And that brings us to this incredibly powerful quote directly from the text. Norway did it with oil, we can do it with our red dirt. It's a passionate argument that a proper sovereign fund could ensure future generations actually benefit from the earth being dug up right now, rather than it just being wasted. Why does this matter? Well, it completely reframes the conversation. We're moving away from talking about a short-term economic boost and instead talking about a long-term generational birthright. The source material is basically saying that letting resource wealth just fund day-to-day operations is a colossal missed opportunity for the country's future prosperity.
Which brings us to Section 2, the proposed export tax.
So, how do they actually plan to achieve this vision? Well, the mandate explicitly relies on a pretty aggressive 3-step plan. Step 1. Slap a 10% tax on export shipments, specifically targeting things like coal, with a big focus on exports headed over to China. Step 2. Take all those newly generated funds and funnel them directly into that national nest egg we were just talking about. But Step 3 is where the immediate domestic benefit kicks in. The proposal suggests using this fund to literally pay for free, or at least dirt cheap, electricity for everyday Australian households. It's essentially a direct wealth transfer model, taking money from international buyers and piping it straight into domestic power grids.
The text labels the current setup as outright economic self-harm, which brilliantly highlights their main economic grievance. Think about it. Right now, domestic power bills are steadily climbing, while these massive national resources are going out the door almost untaxed. According to the author, wealthy buyer nations can totally afford to pay a premium for these exports. So, by not levying this tax, the argument is that the nation is essentially giving away its birthright at bargain bin prices, all while everyday citizens are left struggling with the rising costs of basic utilities. Moving on to Section 3, critiquing climate policy. I gotta tell you, the source material absolutely does not hold back here. Using some very raw colloquial language, calling the situation a pig's arse, the author completely dismisses the current climate push as an absolute disaster. They view environmental policies as simply one giant virtue signal. The claim being made is that politicians get to fly overseas, pat themselves on the back, and preach about climate leadership on the world stage, while back at home, well, domestic electricity gets more expensive, and the real money just flows out of the country. They see this trade-off not as environmental salvation, but as an economic punishment that literally makes average citizens poorer. And this builds into a much broader argument about active economic harm.
The author argues that chasing net zero targets and voluntarily shutting down perfectly functional power plants is effectively crippling domestic industries. The contention is basically this: because the nation is sitting on way more coal than it knows what to do with, artificially restricting its use just to meet global targets makes energy unnecessarily expensive for everyone. From this point of view, the nation is just punishing itself just for the sake of looking green.
Let's turn to Section 4, the export hypocrisy argument. The author zeroes in on what they see as a glaring hypocrisy at the absolute core of this export model. Think about the contrast here. Domestically, local power generation is being shut down and living costs are rising, all in the pursuit of net zero emissions. But at the exact same time, hundreds of millions of tons of that exact same coal are being loaded onto ships and sent overseas to China and India every single year. The coal still gets burned, right? It just gets burned somewhere else by big emitters who keep buying it. So exporting the emissions and the jobs while wearing the domestic cost of trying to look green is framed here as a massive contradiction. And to add an extra layer of irony to the argument, the source material points out a crazy logistical detail. Those massive cargo ships transporting the coal across the ocean, they burn heavy bunker fuel. The text claims that these boats actually pump out more emissions than the very domestic power plants that are being forcibly shut down back home. This detail is used to really cement the idea that current policies aren't actually saving the planet at all. They're just shuffling the emissions around on a global scale while simultaneously hurting the domestic economy.
And finally, Section 5, a coal-fired future. So what's the solution? Well, it leads to a radical pivot. Rather than transitioning away from fossil fuels, the proposed strategy aggressively reverses course. The author argues that we should immediately stop closing existing plants and actually start building new coal-fired power stations. Why? Because the country is literally sitting on centuries' worth of cheap, reliable coal reserves. To the author, it's just ridiculous to try and run a modern economy without utilizing what's right under our feet. The ultimate goal here is to secure reliable and cheap power to drive national prosperity, completely independent of global environmental pressures. As we wrap up this explainer, the source leaves us with a stark ultimatum about the future of national wealth, energy policy, and how resources should fundamentally be utilized. The author paints a picture of a country at a crossroads. Will the nation harness its incredible geological wealth to build a disciplined, multi-generational national nest egg, just like Norway did? Or will it just continue to let its wealth sail away at a massive discount, basically paying for the rest of the world's power, while citizens at home are stuck holding the bill? It's a highly provocative question, and one that definitely forces us to think deeply about energy economics and sovereignty. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer understanding of this fiercely debated mandate.